futurist, but it'll never be our past. In a distant 10-year world, we'll never ever change the past.
Oh, the camera broke again. Damn it, Jan, you need to stop moving around. Anyway, hey everybody.
That's not my fault.
No, I adjusted it. You saw. Now it's whatever. We're fine. It's fine. Everything's fine.
Why are you like this?
Why are you like this?
I didn't do anything.
Yeah, exactly.
No, you're
I just
accusing me of
sat here the whole
stuff.
time.
I'm accusing you of stuff because you're doing stuff. Stop doing stuff.
No.
Yes.
No.
You broke Jan.
I didn't break Jan. Well, yes, I broke Jan. I'll take the blame for that. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to GVN Live. I am your host, as always, Fight Club Hobbs, and with me is Jan, Mark, and we are in for a wonderful show today. It is, well, yesterday was the 20th anniversary of the United States launch of the Sega Dreamcast, the swan song of the Sega home console market. And pretty much we're going to be taking a nice deep dive into the system. We're going to be talking about the history of the console. Will be presented first by Jan. She'll be giving you a look into the history that led before, during, and after its launch. I will be giving you guys a rundown of the stuff that was going on into why the Sega Dreamcast failed, outside of the the more commonly known things like the horrendous business decisions of the Saturn, the oncoming onslaught of the PlayStation 2, and many other blunders. We're going to take a look at some of the other lesser-known things that people haven't considered. And then after that, we're going to have a look at the influence that the Sega Dreamcast has had, both during its run and post. And that will be presented by Mr. Mark B. Writing. Afterwards, we might, give you our top 5 Dreamcast games, or games that you should consider checking out if, you already have the games that everyone tells you to buy. But with that, we shall start off with the show with greeting each other. Hi, Jan. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I am fabulous. How are you? What have you been up to, and what's going on soon?
Well, so just general stuff. A lot of stuff launched over the last couple of weeks. So Iceborne came out over last weekend, so I've been playing a heck of a lot of that. Pretty much Iceborne and Tekken. That's pretty much where I've been concentrating on everything right now. Season 3 came out yesterday, and holy crap. That was literally all my timeline was yesterday, was just Tekken. I was just like, oh, this is nice. I like this. This is something I can handle. So it was nice.
How do you like all the changes they made?
Josie got some love, and I am super happy about that. Eliza got some of the best buffs, though. Like, she is ridiculous now. The fact that you can actually, Vortex with her quarter circle back 3 now is like... I'm so happy about that. Yeah, I guess Zafina came out today in the States. She was out, halfway through yesterday, out pretty much everywhere else because, midnight. She's absolutely crazy in this iteration since the last time she was in the game. She is way different. So a lot of people are having fun with her, so that seems good. I don't know, Iceborne is fantastic. There's
Iceborne, what is this? Please tell me.
So it's interesting because Iceborne right now has 2 separate groups of people right now that are talking about it. The people that are ranting and raving about how good it is, and the people that are absolutely just gobstopped that the weapons at high end look like ass. And it was really stupid too, because a lot of the weapons that we saw that they originally released prior to launch were very specific weapons. So they got us really hype for having weapon autonomy, so that the weapons looked like the monsters or had real specific, very particular looks to them. And a lot of the weapons didn't actually get that. A lot of them, for instance, the Nargacuga dual blades. Everyone knows what those originally looked like. They have like the big guard with the spikes all the way around it, and then the blades. They don't look like anything like that at the top end in Iceborne right now. And so there's a lot of complaining and a lot of very upset players right now at the high end that are very upset with Capcom's decision to remove a lot of the weapon autonomy across all of the weapon trees and only giving them to specific weapons, which a lot of people just didn't understand. So it's kind of interesting to see that whole kind of craziness going on right now in the Monster Hunter community. So we'll see if Capcom decides to patch that, or if they decide to actually fix some of those up to actually make them look like they're supposed to, or make them look better. Because we were expecting a lot more and we didn't get as much as we thought we were going to. So we'll see.
Excuse me. Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm doing great. So what you been up to, sir?
Playing video games, mostly.
Yeah. I hear you're extremely hyped up for this Dayton Colonel Sanders game.
I wouldn't say extremely hyped up, but I am definitely, like, it's definitely a thing I would want to stream when it comes out.
Are you going to censor are you going to play the uncensored version?
I sincerely doubt that there's going to be an uncensored version. This is something that's actually being, like, done by KFC. KFC is not going to let us see the Colonel's fucking finger licking good.
Oof. Yeah, that sounds awful.
The game itself
you don't want to put the Colonel's drumstick in your mouth, Mark?
Hi, TOS.
Look, I'm not here to say yay or nay on that. If that is something that you are into, more power to you.
You don't want to try his secret sauce?
It's not for me personally. I am like a 0 on the Kinsey scale, which is, is fine.
Yeah, it's probably for the best.
But, like, you can, if you want to taste the Colonel's 7 herbs and spices, that is entirely your decision, and you're welcome to it. My thing is, the game itself looks like it's probably going to be like the worst possible version of Dream Daddy imaginable, and I am here for it. I am here for it because it's gonna be dumb as shit. Absolutely. And like if this is how KFC is attempting to remain relevant in an era where Wendy's is fucking dunking on everybody on social media, and McDonald's and Burger King are still like the #1 and #2 companies out there. Fucking okay, more power to you. If
Popeyes
this is what you gotta do, all right.
And Popeyes is fighting for the #1 chicken sandwich in the market.
That's debatable.
I didn't say it was. I was just saying they're fighting for it, but whatever.
Oh, I mean, fair.
Yeah, they can do what they want. I'm not a Popeyes fan. There's one near me, ish, but like I'm not a Popeyes fan. Never have been. I have baby mouth, so very very opposed to like heavily spicy food products.
That's fair. I mean, their mild isn't that bad, but I'm pretty much in the same boat. I get it.
The thing that kind of struck me as odd, though, was, I mean, and I understand, like, this is the thing we've been talking about for at least a few months now, and, like, it's been, like, an oh my god kind of thing, but it just struck me how weird it is that we live in a world now where you can just pay a company $10 a month and just get, like, their newest releases the day they come out, just on your platform of choice, and just play them. Like, I've been sitting down for the past couple of days, and I've been playing Gears 5. Like, it just came out on Tuesday, and I did not spend the $59.99 plus sales tax required to own a physical copy of this. I just gave Microsoft, like, $15 or $10 or whatever it is, and they're like, okay, you can play this the day it comes out without owning it. Oh. Alright. Thanks.
You hear that, Stadia? That's Microsoft saying, fuck you.
It's just very strange to me that we live in a time where that is a thing that you can do now. Like I mentioned it to Hamish. Did you play as Batista? No, I think he's only multiplayer. but I mentioned this to Hamish, and he was just like, "Yeah, 15-year-old me would have been really excited for this," and I'm just like, "Fucking 40-year-old me is excited for this now."
Mhm.
It's just amazing. Like, I don't have to fucking pay money for that shit. It's just, oh, I can just play this. That's fine. Cool.
All right. Well, outside of what you guys been doing, what I've been doing is I'm probably going to be moving one of my stream nights. It's going to be Wednesday. I'm most likely going to move it to Sundays because the Wednesday Night War is about to start in a couple of weeks. Well, NXT starts streaming on USA in a couple of weeks, and then October 2nd is when we get AEW. So that should be fun. So I'm going to definitely
Yeah,
be a
NXT is
wrestling
only going
fan.
to be doing a live hour for
The first
a
two
couple
shows,
of
though.
weeks. Yeah, because fucking Suits. Like, look, fuck off, Suits.
I would much rather have NXT.
Yes,
Much
and
rather.
then they're going.
What, you don't like Orange Cassidy?
I just don't like Suits.
Yeah, like you're. It's not a question of I'd rather watch NXT than AEW. I'd rather watch NXT than Suits.
Yeah.
Like, the actors in Suits are fine. The show is deeply fucking boring to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they're going to officially go to a 2-hour show when AEW's show debuts. Because Vince isn't ass mad at all about
Not
the
at
idea that somebody is releasing fucking, like, if you could do this, like, I know that there's no way they could do it because, like, you have to fucking sell advertising time and all this other shit, but if they could have done this, I really would have thought it was great if, like, Cody and them had fucking announced they were going to do the show on Wednesday, and then NXT was announced for Wednesday, and they'd be like, you know, JK, we're releasing our show on Thursday, LOL, you know.
One good hope.
Fuck you, you know.
Yeah, so outside of that, now for my stream tonight, I haven't decided what I'm going to do. I actually started thinking once again about maybe doing Dead or Alive or fighting game centric bi-weekly online tournaments again. I haven't decided if I want to do it or so, but for the time being, I'll just probably bounce back and forth between Monday and Sunday as my Monster Hunter nights until I figure out what I want to do, since I have the
Makes
game
sense.
on both platforms, Xbox and PS4. And I've been
not played a fighting game forever.
and I've been playing Iceborne. I love Iceborne. I haven't gotten that far in it because I don't have that much time, but hey, I actually haven't. Outside of it taking me a little bit of a long time to kill these, G rank monsters, it's not that hard. I mean, I managed to get some decent armor without killing arch-tempered elders to survive my first 3 encounters. Viper Kadachi's a bitch.
That double damage poison.
Oh yeah, that was like he hits you, you lose a lot of life, and then that poison kills you just before you get up. It sucked ass. But anyway, enough about what I have to play. Let's talk about what we used to play. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are here to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the U.S. launch of the Sega Dreamcast, Sega's swan song in the home console market. And with that, we are going to start with our first of 3 segments, and I'm going to turn it over to Jan. So, have at it.
So everyone fondly looks back at the Dreamcast as probably one of the better consoles that was pretty much ever made. Simply just, it was ahead of its time. It had relatively powerful output. The games, some of the games actually still hold up quite well, considering. If you go back and look at a lot of the games that came out, especially towards the end of its life cycle, a lot of the 2D stuff looks fantastic. A lot of the 3D stuff that was made specifically to the graphics set and the system build itself, like Power Stone and all those kind of games like Rival Schools, those games still hold up pretty well considering where they came from, the era that they came from. Hell, even Virtua Fighter looks pretty solid. I mean, we all know Soul Calibur is a thing, so...
Soul Calibur still looks really rad, even like decades after the fact.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Especially
Soul Calibur
in a VGA,
was...
especially through a VGA box.
Blue Stinger, not so much, but you know.
Yeah. At least it's not Dino Crisis. Oh wait, what?
Oh, there are worse looking games than Dino Crisis.
I
yeah.
know. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
So just as a baseline, so people kind of
Nightmare
understand
Preachers.
what was really good was on this is the device itself had a 16 gigs of internal RAM, an 8 meg video RAM, and 2 megs of audio RAM, and supported probably one of the coolest ideas in the controller, which was the VMU, which was a liquid crystal, and a little LCD display inside of it, so you can see things on it. It visually allowed you to see aspects of games that you probably wouldn't normally been able to deal with without that extra little screen. So things like putting your plays on your VMU for like 2K game, or being able to take a look at like little things that like kind of kept it hidden or helped you do stuff. And then if you took it out, it had a little controller on it, so you could actually play other games, like with the Chows from Sonic Adventure. When basically the way it worked out was like people pretty much saw around 95 that Sega was collaborating with a bunch of different companies, including Lockheed Martin, 3DO, Matsushita, which is also known as Alliance Semiconductor, to create a new graphics processing unit, specifically so that they could possibly work on what they, at time, people thought would be a 64-bit Saturn II, or at least some sort of an add-on peripheral. Whatever ended up happening with that, the Dreamcast itself was completely and wholly unrelated to it. It wasn't that. But Saturn's poor performance, everybody started looking outside of the company, outside of all of the internal stuff that they had already built, to try to find something for a new console. So Iramajiri decided, you know what, I'm going to go talk to IBM. And all of a sudden, all of these people are starting to work on these new processors. And it was really interesting because at that time, they started working with PowerVR 2 and the Hitachi SH4 processor architecture. A lot of this is probably not going to mean a lot to anybody, but the thing that did make a lot of sense was that when they started working on it, they actually reached out to, if anybody remembers the old 3DFX company, they originally were going to be using a Voodoo 2 and Voodoo Banshee graphics processor alongside a Motorola PowerPC processing unit. But because Sega kept pushing and pushing and pushing for the Hitachi, eventually, because they wanted something that was off the shelf, it was just this big sort of wobbly table. No one really knew where they were going to go. So in 97, 3DFX went public. They offered their IPO, and because of legal obligations, had to unveil the fact that they had a contract with Sega, including development of the new console. Sega was absolutely livid in Japan. The executives were like, why are we doing this? So they straight up just cut ties with 3DFX. At that point, Japan kept saying, hey, look, we want Japanese hardware in a Japanese system. We want to build this for the Japanese public. Eventually, they got to a point where NEC was pretty much the deciding factor. So because NEC was so ingrained in the Sega architecture of building the system, the Japanese team won, and so as a result, they cut ties early with 3DFX. They ended up going with the in-house architecture. 3DFX actually filed a lawsuit against both Sega and NEC claiming breach of contract, which obviously got settled out of court because we never really heard anything of it again. The interesting fact about this was by going with the PowerVR architecture instead of the 3DFX architecture, this sort of already kind of spelt the beginning of the end of the system. Like, it hadn't even been completely finished yet, and at that point, EA, who had been a longtime developer for Sega and had invested in 3DFX said, we're not familiar with this other architecture, we're not going to program for it. So that was already a huge blow against Sega when they started making everything go together. So at this point, the Saturn is still set back by high production costs and complex hardware. Things are kind of looking dim. Not a lot is really going their way. And so Sega's like, we're going to do simple. We're going to make it easy for people to make it so that it's modular and simplistic and easy and off the shelf. This is a thing that they say a lot during a lot of the time leading up to the release of the Dreamcast is it's off the shelf. It's built to be simple and modular and easy to get into because they knew that the Saturn was just not very simplistic. It wasn't something that people could get into as easily. So when they started working on all of this towards the end of 98, give or take, they'd already had an idea of what they wanted to call it, but they weren't really sure that they were going to keep it that as the code name. Originally, they renamed it Katana. But then they're like, well, maybe not. So they held a contest to see what people would actually name it. All the while, they're having opposition from internal staff about adding the modem, which, as we all know, is one of the key reasons why the Dreamcast was a better system in the long run. Having that modular availability of having that modem really helped to breathe what little life needed to be in that system, However, the idea of going from a normal CD-ROM to the GD-ROM, which gave you the gig of data versus the 650 meg CD-ROM, meant that you'd have to worry about whether or not people were going to try to illegally download it, or like. So they had an idea of like where they wanted to go and what they wanted to do with the system to keep it sort of proprietary, but keep it also safer from the wiles of the ever-growing internet. Eventually, they get to the point where they're working with Windows and Microsoft, and they actually had a version of Windows CE with a DirectX link to like an API and dynamic link libraries, DLLs. So it made it really super easy to port PC games from the PC into the Dreamcast. So again, we can see where they're kind of going with it. They wanted to have all of this kind of stuff, but eventually they're like, it's going to help. We're not sure it's going to be the big push we need it to be. Because again, we've already lost EA from the onset before the system even launched, and we're already on thin ice with, at the time, Squaresoft. So we'll just see how it goes. We've got other people that are willing to do it. We'll try to push more first-party stuff, and that's kind of where they started. Dreamcast goes to launch in Japan, and Sega couldn't achieve its shipping goals because of a shortage of PowerVR chipsets caused by a high failure rate in the manufacturing process. So half of its stock that was pre-ordered, already taken care of, already sold, half the stock, they had to stop pre-orders in Japan. November 27th, 1998, it launches at full price, 29,000 yen, and the entire stock sold out by the end of the day. Of the 4 games that were available at launch, only a port of Virtua Fighter 3 sold well. So
I guess people weren't really that hyped for Godzilla Generations or Pen Trisolin.
Probably not so much. At this point, Sega estimated that an additional 200 to 300,000 Dreamcast units could have been sold with sufficient supply. At that point, key games such as Sonic Adventure, Sega Rally Championship 2, which had been delayed, arrived within a few weeks, but sales were still just lower than expected. Irimajiti hoped that they would sell over 1 million Dreamcast units in February, but less than 900,000 were sold, undermining their attempts to actually build a sufficient install base to hopefully keep the Dreamcast alive. The thing that was really interesting is that because of the fact that not enough systems were available, and a lot of people that did get it just didn't have the games, like the base game launch roster just wasn't powerful enough for people to keep the system. And at that point, disappointed Japanese consumers were starting to return their Dreamcasts and use those refunds towards PlayStation software. They were just buying more PlayStation games. Seaman releases in July of 1999, just shy of the September release in the States, which actually was considered to be the very first big hit on the console. Now, at that point, prior to the launch, Sega actually reduced the price of the Dreamcast to 19,900 yen, making it unprofitable, but it increased the sales. So they dropped the price point, and all of a sudden they started to see increase in sales. At that point, when they decided to release the lower price point, was also the release of Soul Calibur. Now, this also helped them to gain an additional 17% on its shares. So, huge deal. But we're still sitting here going, okay, we have a great system. People are starting to get interested in it. We've got more games coming out, games that people enjoy and are showing us that are big hits like Soul Calibur and Seaman. But EA is still not it's not part of the system. So EA is still nixing the idea of the Dreamcast. We're not going to build anything for it. We're not going to be on this console anymore. We're done with Sega. At that point, Sega, had built up and gotten some stuff together, and they purchased Visual Concepts. Now, Visual Concepts, for some who may or may not know, Visual Concepts is originally the company that had the license to the NFL 2K game series. So they built what a lot of people saw as a far superior football game than, at that time, the Madden series. And was a great thing to do, and had interactions with the VMU, so you can see your plays and hide it from people while you're playing locally. You could use it on your VMU when you're playing online. So there was a lot of things that there was there. So along with Visual Concepts, they also worked with Midway, who made 4 launch games for the system. And they took advantage of the 10 months following the Dreamcast release in Japan. That way, when it launched in the US, we had a minimum of 15 launch games. I think it actually launched with 19?
19 games, yes.
19. So it launched with 19
Considered
games in the States.
Considered the largest console launch for, number of games released for a
Right.
system. Up until, I think, the PS3. I could be wrong.
I think so. So 99.99. This is a number that everyone can remember. If you had anything to do with the Dreamcast, you remember that number. 99.99 was the launch date, September 9th, 1999, at a price of $199. Sega marketed the ever-living crap out of the US launch of the system. After watching what happened to Japan, after seeing the falling numbers, after seeing the writing on the wall was already there, and Sega's like, we have to make the US launch the big deal. If we can't get the US audience on board with this system, there's no way it's going to match. They're already freaking out about the fact that Sony is kind of in the background with its PlayStation hardware. There's probably going to be something new looming. We need to do something about it. So they did this massive marketing campaign on television, and included with all of the video game magazines and demo discs and everything like that. There was just tons of Dreamcast marketing, all about this whole, it's listening montage and everything that they pushed. So it launches. Sega Sega sets a new sales record by selling more than 225,132 Dreamcast units in 24 hours, earning them just shy of $100 million in what most people called at that time the biggest 24 hours in entertainment retail history. Within 2 weeks, Dreamcast sales exceeded 500,000. So we're already at 500,000 by Christmas, which is crazy at that time. They had a huge market share, but it wasn't enough to really dethrone Sony. It just wasn't going to happen at that point. They had a good push, and it was building off on what they had with the launch roster. Games like Soul Calibur, NFL 2K, all of that was really a big reason why the system pushed as well as it did. And it started to look like things were trending up. They had a little bit of a hiccup because one of the manufacturing plants was producing defective GD-ROMs. So some of the games just didn't work. So you'd have to return it, and then
mostly Midway games.
And, it was mostly
Hydro
Midway.
Thunder and Mortal Kombat Gold were the biggest culprits.
Yep. And some people had issues with NFL 2K, though that was very limited. October 14th, 1999, it releases in Europe, 200 Great Britain pounds. By November 24th, another 400,000 consoles had been sold in Europe. By Christmas of 1999, Sega of Europe reported another 500,000. So 6 months ahead of schedule. That's great. Good numbers. Sales didn't continue, however, and by October of 2000, Sega only had about 1 million sold in Europe. And of course, as part of Sega's promotions of the Dreamcast in Europe, they sponsored 4 European football clubs, including Arsenal FC, AS Saint-Étienne from France, Sampdoria from Italy, and a Spanish team that I am not going to try to pronounce because I'm probably going to murder it, so we're going to move on. At this point, obviously, we know that the last launch date is going to be the Australian. So basically, the way it worked out was Japan was in 98, September 9, 1999 was the US, October 14th, 1999 was the EU, and then November 30th of 1999 was Australia. So you have all 4 of the major regions with a new console within the first year of its life cycle. Even though it was successful, Sony still has 60% of the overall video game market share in North America with the PlayStation at the end of 1999. And now, so the thing is that between the launch of the Dreamcast in Japan and the launch of the Dreamcast in the States, Sony is like, hey, we're going to release an announcement. So on March 2nd, 1999, months before the release of the Dreamcast in the United States, they announce the PlayStation 2 as this new video game console to convey unprecedented emotions, this thing called the Emotion Engine. And it just kind of went crazy, and people were looking at all of these viral ads and all these crazy vaporware style, aesthetics that all of a sudden are pushing competition with the Dreamcast, and the system hasn't even released in the States yet. By the end of 1999, Dreamcast sales had exceeded 1.5 million, which is still a big deal. Saw huge declines as early as January of 2000. Poor Japanese sales combined with just a straight net loss ending FY March 2000. This marks Sega's 3rd consecutive annual loss in the console market, both from the Saturn and from the Dreamcast. They still saw decent numbers in terms of market share because there's still a lot of people that have the console. Sega is just screeching to a halt at this point. Now, before anything super crazy happens, September 7th, 2000, Sega.com launches SegaNet, the Dreamcast's internet gaming service. with a subscription price of $21.95 per month. Now, at this point, they'd only previously released one online multiplayer game, which was Choo Choo Rocket. They quickly started releasing of the ability to play more games. This led into NFL 2K1, and then additional games supported, such as Bomberman Online, Quake 3 Arena, Unreal Tournament. Most of the show's personal favorite game, Phantasy Star Online. That's another game that came out. Super fun. If you haven't played it, you don't know what you're missing. But I mean, I lost close to 9 or 10 months of my life to that game. So yeah, I played a lot of that.
I'm still playing it 19 years later, 20 years later.
I mean, we all are. It's fine.
Yeah.
In some iteration or another, we're playing it still.
I played it for a while, though.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'm pretty sure we all did. At that point, we saw that... So, Sega was super aggressive at this point, and they needed to be, because they knew that the PlayStation 2 was going to be this big nail in the coffin if they couldn't find something to really bring the people to the Dreamcast system. So, what they decided was that when the launch happened, they advertised SegaNet, including a spot on the MTV Video Music Awards on that same day. They employed aggressive pricing strategies with basically how it worked out in Japan. Any Dreamcast that you bought included a free year of internet access, which Okawa at the time, one of the big mucky mucks in Sega, personally paid for out of pocket. Prior to the launch of SegaNet, they'd already offered a $200 rebate to any Dreamcast owner who purchased 2 years of internet access from Sega.com. To increase SegaNet's appeal in the US, Sega dropped the price of the Dreamcast to $149, compared to the PS2's US launch price of $299, and offered a rebate for the full $149 price of the Dreamcast and a free Dreamcast keyboard with every 18-month SegaNet subscription. Basically,
giving it away
said,
for free.
Basically, yes, that's exactly what they were trying to do. And the thing is that a lot of people internally and externally basically said you need to sell at least 5 million units in the US by the end of 2000 in order to remain a viable platform, and Sega hit 3. So they kept trying to lower prices, they kept trying to give rebates, they kept trying to do all of this crazy stuff, and that really led to escalating financial losses. So instead of an expected profit for the 6 months ending in September 2000, Sega posted a 17.98 billion yen loss. It's a $163 million loss, with them projecting a year-end loss of 23.6 billion yen. And that basically, the estimate was more than doubled to 58.3. And in March of 2001, Sega posted a consolidated net loss of 51.7 billion yen, or $417.5 million. So while the PS2's October launch was marred by shortages, which I remember that, we were hanging outside of Kmart with raffle tickets to see who could actually go in to buy their limited stock of PlayStation 2s. So no, I remember that, and it was the middle of October.
Fights that broke out
cold.
too.
Ooh. My favorite was the one that actually had the guy, he walked in, he walked out, and he smashed it in front of everybody. That happened at least once every major console release going forward, especially because people were like, that's stupid, why would you spend that money just to break it? I mean, it must be nice to have that kind of expendable income, but also you're an idiot. At that point, that didn't help as much as they wanted it to. A little bit, but not as much as they would hope. People waited for the PS2. The PS1, which was the remodeled version of the original PlayStation, was still the best-selling console in the market at the start of 2000. Everybody that hoped that this was going to be a thing and fix what happened with the Dreamcast, it didn't help. So at this point, 2000, we're closing in on 2001. Executives are basically like, what are we going to do? And then January 31st, 2001 hits. Sega finally announces the discontinuation of the Dreamcast after March 31st, and the restructuring of the company going forward would be a platform-agnostic third-party developer, which is who they are and what they are today. At that point, they continued to drastically reduce the price of the Dreamcast. It went from $149 down to $99, eventually down to $79, and was cleared out of stores at, yes, $49.95.
I remember seeing those prices, but that was around
April
2003-ish. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, the system was officially discontinued, in like 2002, with this last game being NHL 2K2.
Yes.
But there was I do remember just constantly seeing that price drop and thinking maybe I should get a second one.
Yeah. Well, so while we all know sort of the concept behind why it was what it was, and the fact that from there was a let's see here, there was a quote from the staff of Newsweek saying, "From Sonic to Shenmue, Sega's programmers have produced some of the most engaging experience in the history of interactive media. Unshackled by a struggling console platform, this platoon of world-class software developers can do what they do best for any machine on the market." If long and short is, three big things really happened. They knew that the Saturn wasn't doing as good as they wanted it to, so they made changes. They went to an internal structure, and with a system that was very powerful, did what it needed to do. Didn't quite hit the mark the way they thought it was going to. The loss of being able to utilize big, heavy hitters in the industry at that time of Electronic Arts and Squaresoft really hindered the system as well, and not just really having a solid base in an idea of what really happened to what could have been a much more beloved system outside of like the cult following that the Dreamcast really had, really just sort of speaks to the whole concept of what the system could have been. Though, for what it's worth, there were still people 10 years ago, 5 years ago, who were still making games for the Dreamcast.
They still are.
I'll be really honest, there are still people who make games for the Saturn, but that's a totally another story. A lot of it was pretty much just, there was a lot of things that were marred by what could have been and what should have been, but ended up not being because of decisions that were made very early on in the Dreamcast's initial creation process. And I think a lot of that is a big reason in terms of sort of where it started and where it came from, is kind of where it ended up.
All right. On top of that, I mean, with some of the things that were going on with Sega, I mean, this is a system that was, for the most part, outside of just the rocky launch in Japan, which gaming journalists across the board were like really hesitant about the Sega Dreamcast when it was coming out a year later. I remember reading the Game Informer coverage of the Sega Dreamcast, and they were talking about the games coming out for it at the launch of the Japan, and they were just like, yeah, we think Sega's shooting themselves in the foot here. They need to pull out a miracle. And when they did that with the Sega Dreamcast US launch, I mean, in 2 weeks, 500,000 units sold. I believe the total numbers was 520, and they were close to 1 million by the year's end. But things slowed down like exponentially as the holiday 2000 season came around, especially with the PlayStation 2 having its shortage. Sega tried to capitalize on that shortage and even took jabs at Sony, and like it nothing really worked. And there's a lot of reasons behind that too, and I can get into that when it's my turn for my segment. But the one thing that there's to take away is that the transition to third-party support. You just talked about the one head of Sega. On his deathbed, just before he passed away, about a year or so later, for the smooth transition, I mean, you said they were about, what, $450 million worth equivalent in debt at that point?
Yeah.
He put about $550 million of his own dollars on the line to help the company transition from consoles.
So
Yeah.
it was really interesting because basically what he ended up doing was he completely forgave the debt that Sega had to him, put what he needed to help the company go through that smooth transition from a first party console creator to a third party console agnostic company, purely because he knew that this is what ended up needing to have happen. So he not only forgave Sega all of the debt that he had, he gave up what he needed to help the company stay afloat in the transition process, which was like huge props, because at that point it was like, at that point it was either do or die. If they didn't have any way of being able to restructure, Sega as we know it wouldn't even exist anymore. Like, it would have most likely shut down and people would have split.
Yeah. If even Sega were to try and hold off for another year, I mean, literally right around the time of Sega's announcement of discontinuing the Dreamcast, Nintendo came out with the announcement of the Dolphin, and Microsoft came out with the announcement, hey, we're entering the console fray. So the console, I mean, the 90s was full of just people jumping into the console market. I think there was as many as 15 different manufacturers trying to jump into the video game industry. And we're not talking about, like, you know, the well-known people like SNK and Panasonic with their, or 3DO with the Panasonic models, or Commodore, or, you know, Apple Pippin and all that stuff. We're talking, like, you know, people like the Nuon and all these other, like, no-name brands that nobody cared about, just trying to jump in and make a buck. And it got to the point where the console industry just couldn't sustain itself with 4 companies, even if they were the 4 big ones. So Sega was probably making the best decision by bowing out of the industry.
Yeah.
So, anything you'd like to add, Mark?
Not that I can think of at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jan, for that history lesson right there. So, as we move on, the next segment is taking a deep look at the troubles inside Sega. We are not going to be, you know, observing the obvious stuff. Oh, like the impending PS2 launch that was coming out in the middle of the Dreamcast life cycle. The issues with, you know, EA abandoning ship. The problems that came from the Saturn and onwards. The things I want to look at were the things I felt, you know, impacted the console survival rate a hell of a lot more than I think people really led on to believe. And there's actually about 4 things I'm going to touch on. One of those things is Sega's internal issues. There's been nothing for the entirety of the 90s. Sega has been internally fighting between themselves from Nintendo, Sega of Japan, and Sega of America. The second thing was Sega's issues with trying to maintain third-party relationships as well as retailer relationships. That made a major blow to them for the Dreamcast. The other thing I wanted to touch on was, well, to be truthfully honest, nobody really talks about it, but it's the games library that the Dreamcast had. And I'll talk about that because I think that is probably the biggest one of them all. But to start off with the infighting with the Sega, within Sega, it's well documented. As far back as, you know, I would say the earliest inclination of infighting came about when Sonic 2 first came out. Sonic 2 was developed by Sega of America with Yuji Naka heading it. And Sega of Japan was, you know, busy making Sega Sonic CD at the time. And right there was like, you know, there was some headbutting going on because it was like kind of like an ego thing. Like, yo, Sonic is ours, and we appreciate you making a better game. But it's just like, you know what? But at the same time, you have to look at it like this. Sonic was not that popular in Japan. During the rise of the Genesis, that was all due to Sega of America marketing. Because they had to get on, they had to jump. Because if you look at the Master System, it did not do well. From a marketing standpoint. Japan, the Genesis, or the Mega Drive, when it came out in 1988, it didn't do so well. It wasn't until, you know, some former toy businessmen, I believe Mattel or some, I forget the name, another toy company, had the rights to distributing the Sega Genesis, as they renamed it in North America. and they put a huge push in terms of marketing and giving it an image and just taking away market share from Nintendo little by little, as well as getting some hardcore support from third-party developers who at the time were now getting out of their licensing agreements of developing 4 or 5 games a year for the Nintendo. Then you go on and you see that Sega Genesis had a strong library of games. It was the arcade at home, as you put it. And that went on for the entire lifespan of the Genesis, although it evolved. It had some great games. It had great platformers, RPGs, puzzle games. It became a fully fleshed out system and a force to be reckoned with. Mid-90s happened. And then the Saturn debacle happens with North America. There was that infighting between Sega of America and Sega of Japan, because it started as early as the development of the console itself. You actually had multiple console plans for the Saturn. We had Sony actually approaching Sega of America. I forget who the head of the company was at the time, but he took those plans because they were in talks. Went to Sega of Japan, who immediately threw everything out the door, because after Sony was betrayed by Nintendo at E3 of '94 or '93. They went to Sega about producing a console with them, with the PlayStation tech. And after that was rejected, of course, you know what happened. In which case, I forget the name of the guy. I think it was Kalinsky. I don't remember. But he was let go by Sega of Japan. He was fired. They brought in Bernie Stolar. And Bernie Stolar had a short stint with Sony as well, and with Nike, before being hired at Sega of America as the CEO. There were some interesting transactions. Like, for the longest time, I've given Bernie Stolar shit about how he ran, Sega during the era of the Sega Saturn, and to hear his stories about how there was so much infighting and how he literally would go to Sega of Japan and yell at them saying, like, what the fuck is wrong with you people? In regards to, like, their decision making. Like, apparently it was them who was pushing the Sega Saturn to be launched really early in North America in 1995, which is something he was vehemently against. And I give him a lot of respect. Now, the Saturn flopped hardcore. Yes, we know this already. And that led to the rushed development of the Sega Dreamcast, which at the time we do know had 2 different models actually in development as well. There was the Katana and the Dural. The Dural was the IBM-led and E3DFX-led developed console, which was to be making it as powerful as possible and as robust of a console as it could possibly be. And this was presented by Sega of America. And like, as you pointed out in the history, Sega of Japan stood their ground and said, no, Japan made. No.
We're going with NEC and Hitachi, and we're going with the Japanese system. And
that is, and again, more headbutting right there. And that is one of the last straws right there that Bernie Stolar's had with the company. And he literally had to do everything he could to salvage from the debacle of a launch of the Sega Dreamcast in Japan. He literally had 8 months to put together a rush of a successful console launch lineup. And it was just a madhouse. I mean, people think that Sega was celebrating like hardcore when the Dreamcast launched. No, they were still freaking out, because just about a month before the Dreamcast launch, Bernie's gone. They fired his ass. Even though he put behind efforts to give the console one of the strongest like launch lineups, the most hyped launch lineups, he picked up from the mistakes that Sega of America was literally forcing onto him and making it, trying to turn gold out of shit. And when he was let go, of course, the momentum that he built up was continued on by Peter Moore. And Peter Moore is seen as literally the savior of the Sega Dreamcast. And if you see interviews with him, Peter Moore has nothing but wonderful things to say about his time at Sega when he was head of, Sega of America during the lifespan of the Sega Dreamcast. He talked about how frantic it was leading up to the days of the launch and all that stuff. And he, again, himself was having issues with Sega of Japan, because it was literally nothing more than just a back and forth power struggle between the two. And all of that did nothing but caused chaos between the company. Like, there was too many like brash decisions. Like, there was possibly some great ideas, great IPs that were never brought over states to the Sega Dreamcast. Like, we never got to see the Sakura Wars series, which had its re-releases, the first 2 games re-released in the series and then brought over. Granted, the RPG genre was still a niche, a strong, but it was stronger at that point in the late 90s, but it was still a niche. And Sega, on the Dreamcast end, did not have a whole lot of, RPGs, which more and more people were getting into. But that's all part of the games, and I'll be talking about that later on. So, up until the end, it was put on the shoulders of Peter Moore, because, let's be honest, Japanese businessmen are like assholes. They need to put the blame on somebody. So, as a way... I mean, you know what happened to Gunpei Yokoi with the virtual... with the virtual boy.
Oh, yeah.
You take that damn thing and you sit in that tiny little corner over there at E3. That's what they did to him. And this is what they did to Peter Moore. They said, okay, you know what? We're going to put this all on you. You go out there and you make the decision of whether or not this console's going to live or die. So Peter Moore is, like, literally for about a month, I believe he said, he had to come up and make the decision to end the Dreamcast. The decision was given to him. And then in March, my dad calls me up into the living room. Hey, Bob, there's the president of Sega's on the news, and it's on CNN. And he's like, I'm here to announce that the Sega Dreamcast, we are canceling production of the system right away. We have too many consoles in our warehouse. And it was really, it's poor leadership, poor management, and it's just a company that just could not get itself together, and it hurt itself. And slowly but surely, all of that stuff was leaking through from the mid 90s and on, and then of course a lot of that came to fruition in the mid to late 2000s. And it's amazing how Sega didn't just completely implode on itself and is still around to this day. The next thing that really hurt the Dreamcast, and most people don't realize this, and it's a big one, third party and vendor support. I mean, yeah, sure, EA was a huge blow to the Sega Dreamcast because Sega and EA were partners in the console industry since the launch of the Sega Genesis. Like, that Genesis, that little black box, made them so much money just off of their Madden line, their sports line. I mean, yeah, Sega has been known for their sports games as well, but when they got somebody to, get like some definitive sports games for the console, they ran with it, and EA they had their back the whole time. They had their back on the Saturn. I mean, they weren't getting as much of a return as they were on the PlayStation, but still. Other companies that they were losing, I mean, granted, again, it's not a big company, but it was Working Designs. They were the company that were bringing those niche games over for Sega, and of course, a stressed out Bernie Stolar kind of ruined that for them. So now then, as of course we do know, a few years later they collapsed and shut down because Sony's policies and returns of porting games over to the PlayStation 2 was really, really stupid. Other companies, Sega was really hurting. They leaned heavily on Capcom. They leaned heavily on then unknown company Ubisoft. I mean, they were slowly growing in the ranks in the late 90s, but they were a hell of a big gamble. Another big gamble, Infogrames.
Yep.
They were leaning heavily on these unknown game companies that were publishing and releasing games that, were trying to find an audience. The last thing out of that, though, was the vendor issue. As I mentioned, because, and this is all back to the Sega Saturn, because of that surprise launch. So many game console companies, video game companies and toy stores weren't ready for the stock to be dropped on them. Some of them didn't even get their stock. And because of that, they were salty as hell and refused to carry any future Sega products. The biggest one, of course, at the time in the United States, KB Toys. They refused to stop. They refused to stock and sell any kind of Sega-related video product, even third-party products. They stopped carrying them when the Dreamcast halted business. It was a huge blow to them. I mean, at the time, the two biggest video game retailers was Toys R Us and KB Toys. And when you have half of the market literally stopping to sell your product, you're in trouble. And that is a huge blow right there. And it's just amazing how people don't seem to realize, oh yeah. But again, yeah, like the Saturn kind of indirectly affected this in a huge way, because that's like right there. You said they struggled to sell 5 million units by the end of winter 2000. There's part of the reason. Somebody who owned about 40% of the toy market was refusing to sell your product. So that's gonna shoot you in the foot right there. The last thing, and this might be a bit of a controversial thought right here, but you got to think about it for a second. When you think Sega consoles, what are the type of games that come to mind? Starting as early as the Sega Master System and the Genesis, and even the Saturn. Arcade and sports games. And that continued with the Sega Dreamcast. One of the big reasons why people were not really latching on to, let's just put aside for the fact that the Saturn had a shitty launch. It sold decently, but not well enough. It sold about 10 million in its lifespan. Literally double that of the Dreamcast. And that's without a Sonic title or any mainstream titles that would catch your attention, okay? The Dreamcast sold 5 million units in its lifespan. And that is with, Sonic the Hedgehog and some other mainstream titles, including popular fighting games like, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and Street Fighter 3 and Soul Calibur. I mean, you have, again, Sega continuing to do what they do best. Release arcade ports. I mean, you had, again, you had a more than arcade perfect version of Soul Calibur. You had, House of the Dead, Sega GT Racing, Sega Rally. You had a bunch of racing games.
It had the definitively best version of Daytona USA as well.
With online as well, as a matter of fact.
Yep.
And there's also lies in the problem. I mean, without EA, they were the only people outside of Konami releasing sports games. And Konami was not really known for quality sports games. I'm looking at you, NFL Quarterback Club.
The only one that actually was probably more played because it was available in the arcade was NFL Blitz, which was Acclaim.
And that had two releases. They had 2000 and 2001 on the Sega Dreamcast as well. But you could also get that on the N64 and the PlayStation. So,
right, but again, this is all purely just based on the time frame and the hardware at the time. The Dreamcast versions were nearly arcade perfect. They had the best, the definitive versions of those games on the Dreamcast.
Yeah, and that is exactly one of the reasons why the Dreamcast was seen as more of an arcade machine than an actual gaming machine. The PlayStation established its footing as, we have everything you want on our system. You want hardcore RPGs, we got them. You want hardcore platformers, we got them. You want insane puzzle games, we got them. You want light gun games, we got them. Hey, Dreamcast, we got about 5 light gun games. Awesome. We got about 100 fighters. Awesome. We got a bunch of shoot 'em ups. Awesome. We got an
MMO.
You have one MMO. I mean, the only saving grace for the Dreamcast was towards the end of its lifespan when all the experimental games came out, but it was too little too late. Seaman, some of the import games like Lack of Love, Rez, Phantasy Star Online, Bomberman, Outrigger, the Quake and Unreal Tournament, like all the online games coming out as well. Jet Grind Radio, Jet Set Radio, whichever you want to call it. They had all these great IPs. Skies of Arcadia. The problem is, the problem is that even though they had these great games, they didn't have what Sony had, which was some of the best third-party companies. They didn't have a Square Enix. Square Enix deal fell through. They were talking about for years about numerous PC games being ported over to the Sega Dreamcast. Who doesn't remember, oh shit, Diablo 2 and Baldur's Gate is coming to the Dreamcast? Fell through. So Commando coming to the Dreamcast fell through. I mean, these were all going to be ported using the Windows CE, SKD to help them bring these games over. Like Sega had these coulda, shoulda, woulda things going on when it came to their games, but they couldn't seal the deal for these people. I love the Dreamcast library. It's very diverse, but it's literally like feels like a bunch of these games I have played in the arcades 10 years prior to the system's release. Like House of the Dead and House of the Dead 2 came out during the reign of the Saturn. Mortal Kombat Gold is just a repackaged Mortal Kombat 4. Hydro Thunder, yeah, that's fun, but it came out in like 95, 96. Like, they pretty much got a bunch of these games that were just given the high-res treatment. The only exception really is Soul Calibur 4, or Soul Calibur, which was literally like completely remade from the ground up.
Oh, it was way better. Way better.
And one of the saving graces of the Dreamcast was really the fighting game community. Because it was the go-to system for the arcade perfect experience for games like Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo X, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, Street Fighter Alpha 3, and so many more. Unfortunately, like I said, because it doesn't have all the games that people wanted. You couldn't get your Final Fantasy games on there. You couldn't get something equivalent to a Crash Bandicoot on there, or Spyro the Dragon, or Medieval. Like, you had, what did you have? Oh, you had Super Magnetic Neo or KO the Kangaroo. Outside of Sonic the Hedgehog, you had Rayman, but again, Ubisoft was still setting their was getting their foot planted on the ground and established. It's just that they didn't have the games that were going to bring people in. They had some great games. And if they had more people, it probably would have sucked them in. But there was no true, like, oh my god, I have to buy a Dreamcast just for this one fucking IP. I mean, look at the games of today. People were buying Xboxes for Halo. People were buying PS3s for, 50 other different games. God of War being one of them. Oh my god, look at God of War 3. People were buying PS4s for, because it's got Street Fighter V and the Xbox doesn't. I mean, okay, I'm stretching it here, but still, I mean, that there was that exclusive license and all that stuff between Sony and Capcom.
I mean, yeah, but the PS4 was so much more. Sony, like, leading up to this point, leading into the PS2 and beyond, Sony at that point was, we have all of the games. We have all the third-party support. We have all the first-party support. We have all the peripherals that you want. This is the system to play them all on. You still had the diehards. You still had the fanboys. There was specific reasons why you would get the Xbox or the Xbox 360 or the Xbox One, because they had that one game that you wanted to play on it. I've gone on record many times saying the only reason I bought an Xbox One was for Killer Instinct. The only reason I bought it. Well, that and the Fence Dragoon game, but that's beside the point. The only reason I got a 360 was because of Virtua Fighter. The only reason I got a 360 was because it had the updated arcade update version of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, since you couldn't really do a very good job of getting a Dreamcast anymore at that point, since it didn't have the arcade perfect version.
Oh yeah.
Like, so there are reasons why you bought these consoles. The thing with like, leading back to what you were saying, the only reason people didn't buy the Dreamcast was because it didn't have that one killer app. It didn't have that one solid game that would really bring in, except for Sonic Adventure. Sonic Adventure is the best selling game on the platform to date. It is, it sold the best. It was the one game that brought everyone to the system. When they found out all the other games that were on the platform, the people that got it for Sonic stayed. But that was the only pull that it had. And by the time Sony was pushing PS2, Microsoft announces Xbox, Nintendo is announcing, all this stuff, and they release, they're announcing Dolphin, and they're releasing 64. Like, at that point, it's just, there's just way too much. They're so far underwater at that point that it's
and you got to look at the launch lineup was great, sure, but what else came out in 1999? A shitload of stuff from Sony, being head-speared by Final Fantasy VIII. I mean, you had some killer apps going into the PlayStation that year of 1999.
Yeah.
And when your best two games is Soul Calibur and Sonic Adventure, I mean, are you going to pick Ready to Rumble over Tekken 3?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Or wait, Tekken Tag came out in 99. No, my bad. But still.
Yeah, but still, like, I mean, it's kind of like the idea of, And I think this was what was really an interesting sort of catch, though, was Capcom was still so spread across the different platforms. So you've got Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2 on Sony, and then all of a sudden they released their Resident Evil 3 version, called Veronica, on the Dreamcast.
Yeah.
Which ended up being overall a better selling game than the original release of Resident Evil 3. So...
Which eventually got released on the Dreamcast as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big problems, though, here with the game selection on the Dreamcast, at least a good third of the games were ports, and then there was a bunch of franchises that were missing. There was no Panzer Dragoon Saga. There was no Virtua Fighter. I mean, granted, it was nice to have two Sonic games after a generation without Sonic.
Well, the thing is it's not so much just the games that you were missing. It was the genre that you were missing.
Oh, yeah.
So if you wanted platformers, if you wanted good, solid, heavy-hitting RPGs, you played on Sony.
Yep.
The only really big RPG that really hit, other than PSO, if you could really call it an RPG, was Skies of Arcadia.
Oh, that's definitely an RPG.
That Skies of Arcadia was like one of the biggest hits on the Dreamcast, purely just because of the aesthetic, the color, the dynamic, the gameplay,
style, storytelling. It was literally the full package that could easily go toe to toe with any of the Final Fantasies from the Sony PlayStation era and on.
Right, it's just too little, too late at that point.
Yeah.
Had it come out maybe a year earlier, and been as good as it was, I'm pretty sure that would have been a big key for people. Hey, the Dreamcast can play RPGs really well and look way better, because we all know the Final Fantasy VIII meme is still a thing, even though technically it's dead now with the remaster, but that's sort of beside the point.
And on top of that, like I said, too little, too late, like all these great original ideas and great games for the Saturn came out halfway through its lifespan, 2 or 3 years. Like, that's when Grandia, Shenmue, I mean, all these great IPs came out, and then they released Sega Net. Even though they've been talking about right out of the box the Dreamcast will be playing online, and one by one, Dreamcast games were losing online support. I was pissed off when I bought Slave Zero, and I couldn't go online for a deathmatch. I was irritated that I couldn't play Street Fighter Alpha 3 online with people. It was just high scores. I was very irritated by a lot of these things. And I can honestly see, people were buying into the Dreamcast at that point, probably to play Street Fighter Alpha 3 online, and when they find out that it doesn't have it, they were returning their shit. So, in the end, I'd have to say the biggest culprit that nobody really looks into why the Sega Dreamcast failed in its 3-year lifespan in the United States was the collection of games that it had on there. Too many arcade hits, too late, and too few with the really good games that came out at the end of the lifespan, the original IPs, the great ideas that they had. They didn't lean too hard on their older IPs. Like, I mean, when they went third party, that's when they started bringing back some of their games, like Outrun and Shinobi. Hell, Virtua Fighter 5, Virtua Fighter 4 was one of the best fighting games I think I've ever played. Still comparable to Virtua Fighter 5 to this day and age. I mean, mechanic-wise, it's just... It was just, again, it also goes into with the internal fighting with Sega, like that I mentioned early on. It's like, what do we want to put out? We need something like this. No, we want something like this. Two people putting their eggs into completely two different baskets and then just bumping into each other and watching all the eggs fall onto the floor is what was going on. And with that, though, I mean, still, in the end, with all this mishaps and all these, woulda, coulda, shoulda games, we still have fond memories of the system. We still have so much to look forward to thanks to the Dreamcast, and it's a lot of firsts and a lot of precedents that are still going on to this day. And Mark, I would love for you to share all that with us as we go into our final segment of the night.
Yeah, it's today kind of sort of feels like it's been a little bit of a downer, I guess you could say. And I mean, with good reason. The Dreamcast definitely had its down points. And if you are looking at the objective history of the platform, it's not hard to end up focused in on the fact that there was a lot of bad to be discussed and to be considered when talking about the platform. But I come here not to bury Caesar, but to praise him. So I kind of want to focus specifically on all of the good that came out of the Dreamcast and all of the things that on some level or another were directly influenced by the Dreamcast that we don't really think about. Either that the Dreamcast did first, or that the Dreamcast did in a way that inspired other developers to follow suit.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing to keep in mind, and it's been talked about briefly during the show so far, the Dreamcast was an out-of-the-box online-equipped console. This was not a thing that developers and console creators were making at that point. You had seen experiments in online gaming starting as far back as, I want to say, even the early Atari days. They were kind of sort of trying to get that going. There was the X whatever it was that was on the Sega Genesis and Super
X-Band.
Nintendo that worked, X-Band, that worked with like Weapon Lord and nothing else.
Yeah.
NBA Jam.
Yeah, NBA Jam. And the Saturn had some experimental stuff, but the Dreamcast was the first platform to come with a dial-up connection out of the box. Sega designed the Dreamcast to be an online connected platform from the moment that it was released into the marketplace, which was unheard of at that point. Even other consoles in the marketplace at that point, the only one that came with anything internet connectivity wise was Microsoft's Xbox. Sony did not come with an internet connected outlet, whatever you want to call it, an internet jack in the device during the PlayStation 2 era. Nintendo did not, like the Nintendo GameCube did not come with an internet connected jack during the GameCube launch. Both of those platforms ended up adding these things in. You could purchase them as additional pieces of equipment, but they were not designed that way from jump. Sega was a pioneer in that regard. And the fact that Microsoft was involved in the Dreamcast, even in the indirect way that they were with Windows CE, you kind of sort of have to think that they were at least somewhat influenced by Sega's decision to include this sort of thing, because they did the exact same thing with the Xbox, except they included a Cat5 connection instead of, or an Ethernet connection, I should say, instead of dial-up, which is where everyone went from the 7th console generation forward. Like, from the 7th console generation onward, we've just had internet connectivity in our platforms. It just, overnight, that just became a thing that everybody was doing. And I don't necessarily say you have Sega to thank for that, because it was kind of sort of going in that direction regardless, but they were definitely the pioneers of that technology in the home console marketplace.
They were the ones that definitely had the balls to do it or follow through on it.
Oh yeah.
Right. And whether or not it was a success or a failure in the end, for the purposes of their influentialness, it doesn't matter. They did something no one else was doing at that point. For a period, they made it successful, and they showed the viability of that technology such that within only a few years, within one console generation, literally everybody does it now. Like, that's the way it's been since the 7th console generation. The second thing, SegaNet. An in-house online platform. Now, Sega's design of this was as much a proper internet service provider as anything else, which is not necessarily something that we do in this day and age. You get your internet service from whoever your your DSL or your FiOS or your cable provider is, and then connect to people's services. But Sega specifically designed SegaNet to be a Sega online connection service. You would use it with your Sega Dreamcast to connect directly to Sega's network servers, and it was designed in a way so that it would connect faster to Sega's systems than anything else. So it reduced, or theoretically reduced, latency between end users when playing games. And it was directly designed into Sega's own network, Sega's own systems to supplement Sega's games. This wasn't the biggest success for Sega, as we mentioned. There was definitely some investment into it, but in the end, the internet marketplace was evolving too fast for Sega to keep up. Within the lifespan of the Dreamcast, wide area network connections, like Ethernet connections on your gaming devices, were becoming more and more of a thing, and dial-up was already starting to go out the door. But the idea behind SegaNet almost certainly influenced what we see today in things like Xbox Live, PlayStation Network, whatever the fuck Nintendo is calling their online connection. They've had like 10 different names for it at this point.
yeah.
Just Nintendo's Internet. There you go.
Oh.
It's very much an influential concept that even if nobody's doing it exactly the way Sega did it, there's definitely a certain degree of thanks Sega for building the framework of what we see today. The next thing, and this is something that is probably going to be a little bit contentious for some people, in-game voice chat. Now, there's people, and there are people in the chat, and I know these people who are going to be like, wait, but no, listen, just hear me out. Console games in general had not done voice chat at this point at all. Like, there was never a need to. You know, you were playing with the person next to you. You didn't need to be able to talk to them over a long distance. If they were a fucker, you just punched them in the arm. Like, you didn't need to question their heritage or the sexual activities of their mother when they were right next to you, and you presumably knew what the sexual activities of their mother exactly were like. So text-based chatting had kind of sort of been a thing in the very small amount of quote-unquote successful attempts console video gaming had done for internet connection. But Sega was like, no, we can't reasonably do something like this with Quake 3 Arena or with Choo Choo Rocket or with Daytona. You can't be expected to take your hands off of the controller to take a second to type this stuff out. And I mean, they did include the ability for you to type out messages, and of course, typing of the dead, which fuck yeah. But typing of the dead is rad as shit. I don't care what anybody says. But they realized you need to be able to directly communicate with people faster than that. So they, in limited quantities, had voice chat integrated into Dreamcast games. And from the console perspective, this was huge. Like, nobody had done this before, and within a couple of years, it became the de facto method for how you communicated in playing games. Microsoft kind of really didn't do as much with that with the Xbox Live service initially. I recall them having it for the couple of games that were Xbox Live enabled, but it wasn't as big of a thing. And Sony's design almost seemed like it was set up to purposefully work around that sort of thing, with games like Monster Hunter, Final Fantasy XI, and the two Resident Evil Outbreak games actively going out of their way to not deal with that sort of mechanic, though for some reason a headset was released for the PlayStation 2 that, as I recall, mostly just worked with fucking Lifeline.
And SOCOM.
and
SOCOM.
SOCOM. You're right.
I remember
But,
those
yeah,
stupid
it was
commercials with the guy, normal guys
Oh,
losing to
no.
the Marines.
I remember Lifeline. That game was awful. It had a predilection for not understanding an American accent, so you had to roll your R's kind of to make it sound like you had a really bad English accent as a Japanese person to get it to actually understand what you were saying.
Yeah, that game was a great idea, but it was not super fun.
Yeah.
And it's just, for as many games as were online enabled for the PlayStation 2, the fact that like SOCOM was the game that worked with this, and of course it was the in-house Sony developed game. Of course they were going to do this sort of thing, but Monster Hunter did not do anything with this. Resident Evil Outbreak, both of those games actively worked around emoting to people. It was the most ass backwards mechanic I've ever seen, and it was such a great idea, and it was just so ruinous from a mechanical perspective.
Wouldn't you attribute that more to Capcom versus Sony, though, since those were all Capcom games as released?
I don't think Sony really encouraged people to utilize that technology.
Okay.
I don't even know if it was something they necessarily had supported, because again, nowadays with the Xbox and the PlayStation and Nintendo's platforms, they have integrated voice chat built into the platform. So it's something you don't even have to deal with.
Right.
But back at that point, Sony was kind of expecting developers to just figure that shit out on their own. You fucking do it. We're not going to be bothered with that shit. Get the fuck out of here. And like that's not going to engender faith from the people on the development end of this, that you have the frameworks to make this work. And frankly speaking, it shouldn't be my job as the game developer to figure out how to make that work. That should be something that you as the platform owner are setting up for me. You know what I'm saying? So the fact that basically the majority of the games that came out on the PlayStation 2 at that point, the majority of the games, I don't think there even was really voice chat on the GameCube. I don't recall using it in any case.
They only had a keyboard, and the only keyboard that was available was one that you had to import from the UK, from the same people who made Codebreaker for the Dreamcast, for the GameCube.
Yeah, I specifically remember playing Phantasy Star Online with friends and using Xbox Live to chat with them while playing Phantasy Star Online, which is just the stupidest fucking thing. But that's just how it is on this bitch of an earth. But the other thing to really keep in mind is that even on the PC, voice chat was, as a ubiquitous mass offering, I should say, was not a big thing in 1999. Individual games could support it, and there were experiments in doing this sort of thing, but like TeamSpeak didn't even come out until 2001 at all, and wasn't really a ubiquitous solution for voice chatting between gamers until multiple years after the fact.
And programs like Skype and MSN and AIM were slowly integrating. I'm slurring on myself, voice chat, but it was usually just a peer-to-peer connection. There was like no huge rooms for multiple people to talk to.
Right. So it's very much voice communication over the internet, voice over IP, was in its infancy at this point, just across the board. So for Sega to just be like, yeah, this is the way that console gaming is going, this is the way that video game is going, we are going to do this, was like, holy shit. And again, by the next console generation, by the 7th console cycle, everybody was doing it. Except for Nintendo, which just...
To us, Nintendo. Online is not the future. Okay, Nintendo. Whatever.
Yeah, they had like this microphone set up where it was like a room-based microphone, and you could hear everything going on in the room. Why would you do this? Why would you do this? Whatever. Anyway, next thing, DLC. We commonly associate DLC with the horse armor on the Xbox 360, right?
Right.
That is usually the point where we point to and we go, yeah, that's when DLC came out and that's where everything started to suck. But the Dreamcast actually had DLC for a few games before that even became a thing in the console marketplace. The Xbox kind of sort of tried to do stuff like that. They had a downloadable expansion for Crimson Skies and a couple of other things. But yeah, DLC really didn't become a thing in the console marketplace again until Elder Scrolls and the Horse Armor. And even in the PC marketplace, you generally saw either full expansions, patches, or mods. You didn't really see like piecemeal add-on components that you could download to your game and do stuff with. This was something that Sega experimented with before anybody else did it. And we can argue about whether or not DLC was inevitably a good or a bad thing all day long. I'm not here to litigate history as far as that goes. I'm just here to point out that this is something that Sega experimented with before it became the thing everybody was doing.
And they had quite a number of games that did that. You had mission packs for Skies of Arcadia and Phantasy Star Online. You could make your own graffiti art or download graffiti art for Jet Set Radio. And like a couple of other games. I think they were Japan exclusive, but I can't remember them right now. But yeah, that's pretty much about it.
Yeah, I mean, it was again just a little experimental thing at that point. Not everybody was doing it, absolutely, but you know, considering that we go from this console that had as many problems as it did, inspired this whole idea of let's download these little goofy things on there to modify our games, or let's share avatars between one another, etc. It's like, holy shit, this had its origins in the little console that could, more or less. Another thing to keep in mind, second screen gaming. I don't think a lot of people really think about this as a Dreamcast thing, but you mentioned it earlier, Robert. The VMU was something that could be utilized to do various functions when you were playing a game. You could use it to pick plays in football games. You could use it to monitor specific stats in RPGs. You could use it to play mini games. Like Sonic Adventure had a little Chow mini game where you could do whatever with the character. This was a thing that you were not seeing in gaming at all, really. Nobody else had done this up to this point. And the VMU was not the best idea from a mechanical perspective. It definitely had its flaws as a memory device, to be sure.
Battery life lasted a month.
Pretty much.
Well,
but there were some really great ideas that ultimately carried on into Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles with its dual screen support, the DS, the 3DS, Wii U, the more modern attempts to integrate tablet-based elements from AAA titles. It's multi-screen gaming is a thing that Nintendo has done very successfully, and other developers have attempted to emulate over the years because it allows for additional input that the player can interact with and do things with. And even if individual people don't execute it as well as others, it's something that has become a part of mainstream gaming for a while now. And we can kind of sort of point to Sega as the progenitor of this concept with their goofy little VMUs and their goofy little Chow mini games.
Though it could also be said, as far as like the dual screen thing too, that I don't know a lot of people even really know about it. What part of the reason why Sony even sort of stepped into trying to compete with Nintendo in the handheld market was was started because of a tiny little device that was kind of like the VMU called the WonderSwan. And it had integrability with the Japanese versions of the PlayStation. So it had a second screen. It was very tiny. It was just like a VMU. It was kind of not what people wanted it to be. They created the WonderSwan Color, which was like a step up. and was sort of their initial foray into making what we would later end up getting, which is the PSP and the PS Vita. But having what they had, like, all of these things really led to innovations that we may not have actually had they not attempted to do it on the Dreamcast.
On top of system integration with a handheld device, before Nintendo was, integrating their Game Boy with the GameCube, the Neo Geo Pocket was doing it with the Dreamcast.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there was certainly less of a degree of interactivity there, but no, there was definitely some solid integration there, which is almost certainly on some level or another something that influenced Nintendo to go in the direction that they did with integration between their handheld and their consoles. The final thing I want to touch on is just the overall longevity of the Dreamcast and how it has kind of impacted how we view independent gaming and how we view the platforms that we play on. You mentioned this before, Robert, but just because the Dreamcast stopped directly being involved in the live development of games for the platform, just because Sega stopped supporting it, just because the majority of developers stopped supporting it, does not mean that people stopped developing on the Dreamcast.
Oh, I never insinuated that, though.
Oh, no, absolutely not. No, you did not. But I'm just making it apparent here. I'm just making it clear. People are still releasing Dreamcast games. Like this year, releasing Dreamcast games.
Yep.
And there are, notable games that have come out on the Dreamcast. Triggerheart X Lycia, which if you saw it on the Xbox 360, the Xbox Live Arcade, excuse me, that was a Dreamcast release at one point. Calrus and Ducks, two big side-scrolling shooters that you would know if you are a huge shooter fan. They're not necessarily as mainstream as Triggerheart is because they didn't see ports elsewhere that I know of.
Ghostblade.
But, yeah, exactly. That's another one. And even more recently, they did remakes of Flashback and Another World, or Out of This World, and released them to the Dreamcast within the past couple of years.
Really?
Yeah.
I had no idea. That's crazy.
A re-release of Breakers also, the fighting game.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, and it's like a lot of proper developers in Japan have been making these sorts of games. But another thing that's really interesting is that indie developers have been releasing games on the Dreamcast. And like the Dreamcast from a console perspective has been a huge boon for independent developers because the tools that you can use to develop on it are, by all indications, fairly easy to work with. And the platform is just user friendly from a developer perspective, making it a great place to experiment with developing these certain things, which is is fucking neat. That's a really neat thing to think about. But it's also increased the visibility of these sorts of platforms being alive and allowing for continued development even though the platforms themselves are decommissioned than it ever had before. Like, the Dreamcast being an active platform isn't necessarily the reason that these things are happening, but it definitely helps. Like, Limited Run just released an NES cartridge.
Yeah.
For Jay and Silent Bob Mall Brawl. Like, this is the only way you can get this game. Like, this is the only way that you can get a copy of this is to buy an NES cartridge from them. I'm sure it'll be released in some other fashion probably later, but just holy shit. I definitely feel like the idea of releasing nostalgia media, I guess you could say, releasing nostalgia media for platforms definitely kind of has to start conversationally from the fact that people have been making games for the Dreamcast, a platform that has been dead for the entirety of its 2 decades of existence. Like, every year just about a game has come out for the Dreamcast, if not several. That's amazing. And it sort of speaks to the idea that, just because your console is done doesn't mean that your console is done. Your console can well outlive its generation. Your console can outlive its initial creators, and there's something really kind of cool about that, I think.
Yeah. Aside from just indie releases supporting the system, one of the big things about the Dreamcast, and this is more of a within the last 5 years, hardcore console modding of the system with release of the DC HDMI, which is a built-in circuit board that is modded into the system, which gives it HD output with in conjunction of the VGA support of the system. And then you have also recently the GDEMU, which is pretty much a device that replaces the GD-ROM, and you put an SD card in and you boot your Dreamcast games from that. There's other mods like Dream Shell, which is a custom BIOS where you also can put a hard drive in the system and boot your games from that. And probably one of the last ones, which makes this insanely impressive, is the Dream Pi, which is a way for you to now go back online with your Sega Dreamcast. And the fact that I can say, hey, look, I'm playing Alien Front Online in 2019 with a Sega Dreamcast is really fucking amazing.
I mean, it's like going back and trying to play the original EDF.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting because, so I know that, so last night I know that Max was doing a stream for the anniversary as well, and he actually showed all of those things off, not the Pi, but all of the other stuff. So he actually has the modded version that actually has a thing where you put the SD card in, and he showed off the BIOS that kind of that. It was actually really interesting. Because he actually had an SD card that had all of the original launch titles. So they played through all of the launch titles of the Dreamcast on last night on the stream, which I thought was impressive. But the other thing that I think is really interesting too is and a lot of people may not if you played PSO recently, which not a lot of people think about, but if you play PSO, there is still a way with the Pi and the network adapter, not the dial-up obviously, because who does that, but with the network adapter that I actually made for the Dreamcast, you can mod that on to allow the Pi to connect to the Blueburst private servers and play it on the Dreamcast. So that's still a thing that you can do.
Oh yeah, that came out in 2000, in the early or late 2000s, thanks to Shitak or Shitserve. And then you have all these other, servers who have come out like Athena and Ultima.
I think Ultima's the biggest one right now.
Yeah, they are, but that's only because there were some issues with the guy who was running Shitak, and he practically, screwed everything up, and other people tried to pick up the pieces, and it's just haven't been the same.
Well, also the one of the big reasons why Ultima is as big as it is as well is because that's if Max goes back to play regular, that's the server he plays on, and so that's the server that everyone wants to play on.
Yeah.
So that is one of the main reasons why it is as popular is because Max plays on it. There's a Benny guild, so that's a thing. But I just think that's just sort of interesting with all the mods and the extras and the lifespan. There's no such thing as a dead console. It's more of just how alive do you want it to be? Because people are still making things for the Saturn. People are still making, as you said before, people are making stuff for the NES. So just because the console is no longer being created does not mean that the games are not still being created.
People are still developing hardware for an Amiga 500. They've made accelerated graphics processors for that damn thing in the late 2010s. They have games that are still being made for it every now and then. It's no system, no console, no computer is still truly dead. Any other final lasting impressions, Mark, that the Dreamcast might have left outside of hardware modifications, which was brought up?
No, I think that's pretty much more than enough. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's a lot that the Dreamcast has been involved in some form or fashion, and
it's amazing how so much has come from a console that's only been around for so short of a time too. The Dreamcast, a grand total of maybe 4 years at most if you include the Dreamcast's release in Japan, up until it's discontinued. It actually discontinued in Japan after it did in the United States. They also, for a time being in Japan, they had a whole warehouse full of refurbished consoles that they had to try and sell out too. So, but we're winding down at the end of the show here, and before we leave, we do want to give you our thoughts of what our favorite Dreamcast games were. I say we'll limit it to 5 right now because, Jesus Christ, we could probably be here all night talking about all of our favorite games.
Probably.
Mark, I'll let you go first.
Oh God, there are so many to choose from. But if I had to pick 5 off the top of my head, I would probably say Mach NX,
Yeah.
Cannon Spike, SNK versus Capcom.
Good choice.
Power Stone, I would think. Picking a 5th one is really hard. I guess Soul Calibur, but there's so many awesome games like beyond that. You know, Ikaruga.
Okay,
Ikaruga.
good call.
That's what I'll go with.
All right, Jan, how about you? What's your 5 games that you would like to talk about?
Oh man, so I'm gonna go a little off. I mean, Typing of the Dead, everyone likes that game. Like, you can, everybody's gonna have that in their top 10 regardless.
Suffer like G did.
I mean, yeah, exactly. So top 5. Soul Calibur, Power Stone, Skies of Arcadia, PSO, and it's kind of a tie for my last slot. Between sort of the Berserk Guts' Rage and there was a Macross game that actually released that was sort of like a Macross anthology game that went across like from the beginning of the Macross series all the way up to, at that time, I think it was like 2001-ish, like early 2001. So it was a lot of the 70s and 80s arcs characters that you got to like actually play through and do a bunch of different missions and stuff like that I actually played. So I think that's pretty much where my top 5 games were for that.
All right. For me, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to pick 5 games that I think people should actually check out and play. I mean, everyone knows about, like everything from Soul Calibur to the Marvel vs. Capcom or Marvel vs. SNK games to, like Skies of Arcadia.
Well, SNK versus Capcom isn't really available, unfortunately. The sequel was available on the PlayStation 2, which I did not like as much, even though it had more characters.
Yeah.
I felt like the animations were shittier. And it was made on a shittier budget.
Yeah. However, I want to mention 5 games I think people should check out because I think these are underrated, underplayed games that never really got a chance. The first one is a vehicular combat game called Red Dog. This is a game that came out towards the end of the Dreamcast life cycle. It was in development for practically the entirety of the system's lifespan as well, and it's pretty much just like you just go from point A to point B, get to this checkpoint, destroy this object or whatever. And it was a really fun, unique game. People should definitely check that out when they have a chance. Another game I think people should check out, and it's a little iffy. It's kind of like an average game, but I found it fascinating, was Draconis Cult of the Worm. It was originally like being pumped up as like the big 3D action adventure game with like, medieval settings and all that. And the frame rate kind of held it back a little bit, but I felt like it was a solid game. The control scheme could have benefited heavily from a second analog stick, but Sega made a bad decision. Let's just put it that way. But it was a decent game. It was a good adventure action game. I felt like a lot of people shit on that game more than it really deserves. Another game I think people really should check out, and it's also available on the PS2, which might make it a little bit more readily available, is Headhunter. It's pretty much an action game, kind of like done in the same way of like Metal Gear, but with a little bit more stealth involved. It's pretty much like a very solid game. It did have an okay sequel that came out on the PS2 and Xbox called Redemption, but I wouldn't blame you for overlooking that one. I found it was a very solid. The Headhunter was a very solid game with a good story, a character that I actually liked, which, in terms of like action games with likable leads, yeah, there weren't that many in the late '90s, early 2000s. How many did I mention? 3 so far?
I think so.
Yeah. There's a platform, and this is a console that doesn't have many. One of them is called Evil Twin. It also came out on the PS2, so if you want to check it out, go right ahead. But Evil Twin, I think, only came out in Europe for the Dreamcast. It's a very twisted American McGee-ish style looking game, if I could properly say that, with like really dark like featured like worlds and gameplay, and very twisted looking. It's just like it's a surreal experience that I think really people should check out when they have a chance. And I would just say the last one, because you could play it online now, Alien Front Online. You either pick an alien or you pick the Earth, get a tank, get an alien ship, just blow each other to fucking hell. It's good fun, and because it was also one of 2 online games that had voice chat. So you hold down the white button, say something that you only got 10 seconds to say, like I fucked your mom, and then just have at it.
Of all the things you could have mentioned or said, that was the thing that you decided to go ahead and cap.
I mean, let's be truthfully honest. There was going to be like a bunch of 12-year-old kids back in 99, 2000 that were absolutely abusing the hell out of that.
Back in 1999. Not now. Heavens forbid, not now. But in 1999,
no, why would they
definitely.
do it now? They're so mature now.
No,
yeah, now it's like 22-year-olds screaming, I fucked your mom.
Yep. But yeah, there you have it. Each of us gave you our own 5 games that we enjoyed on the Dreamcast. And
I'm so disappointed that I couldn't find a way to fit Seaman in there.
Well, I mean, you want to talk about, or you want to pick one off the wall game before we all leave? Go ahead and talk about it, Mark.
I don't really have anything to say about it. You raise a fish with a human head while Leonard Nimoy explains to you how things are going. I really wish that they would re-release that on the PC or something. The voice recognition was the shits. It was just ass. It was just terrible. And micromanaging the environment of the Seaman was a pain in the ass. But I beat that fucking game. I fucking had that little bastard survive all the way to the end and give me his little song and dance number at the very end of that fucking game. Literally, the end of it was like he does like this fucking Michigan J Frog, hello my baby type deal, and it's just so goddamn absurd. And it's all right.
That's the payout. That's my cash out. That's my cat. That's what I get for. Okay.
It's like I'm not even mad. Okay.
Okay. Well, I just have to say that we're going to end the note on the night on a high note. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in for Dreamcast edition of GVN Live. We had a great time reminiscing about the Dreamcast. And with that, I'm going to leave you with this tiny little montage. Everybody, Mark, Jan, thank you so much for joining me again, as always. And to everybody out there, deuces.
Moving through your mind.
You stole my gimmick.
What did you break? Da-da-da-da-da-da. Oops.
Watch this. I've got a plan. I can beat this thing. X. Why? It's thinking. It's thinking.
Can you feel life moving through your mind? Ooh, looks like it came back for more. Yeah. Can you feel time slipping down your spine? Ooh, you're trying to ignore. Yeah. But you can hardly swallow your fears and pain when you can't help but follow and put you right back where you came. Live and learn, hanging on the edge of tomorrow. Live and learn from the works of yesterday. Live and learn. If you fail or if you borrow, live and learn. You may never find your way. Can you feel your life tangle you up inside? Yeah. Now you're face down on the floor. Oh. But you can't save your sorrow. You paid in trade. When you can't help but follow, puts you right back where you came. Live and learn, hanging on the edge of tomorrow. Live and learn from the works of yesterday. Live and learn, if you fail or if you borrow. Live and learn from the works of yesterday. Live and learn, if you fail or
I mean, it was a game that existed on the platform. What are you gonna do?
live and learn.